There is a sound that Grand Central makes at 6:45 in the morning. Not the announcements, not the trains. Before any of that, there is the sound of the building breathing. Hundreds of shoes on Tennessee marble, each one landing differently. A rolling suitcase, a hard heel, someone running. The acoustic dome of the main concourse catches all of it and holds it, the way a cathedral holds silence, except here, the silence never comes. Look up. Above the rush, above the briefcases and the coffee cups and the phones pressed to ears, there is a ceiling painted the color of the sea just before a storm. Constellations drift across it. Orion, Taurus, Aquarius. 2,500 stars, some of them lit from inside, throwing pale light down onto everything below. Mediterranean blue, flecked with gold, the ceiling of a palace set over a commuter railroad. Nobody stops to look at it. They have stopped stopping. That is the first thing you notice about Grand Central Terminal. The people inside it have forgotten where they are. Step back. Further than this morning. Further than last year. February 2nd, 1913. 12 minutes past midnight. The doors open for the first time and New York City walks in. 150,000 people in the first 16 hours. They come not because they have trains to catch, most of them don't, but because they have heard something impossible has been built on 42nd Street and they need to see it for themselves. They stand in the main concourse and tilt their heads back, and for a moment the city outside, that loud, unsentimental city, simply disappears. William Wilgus, the engineer who conceived this building, had a phrase for what he was doing beneath these streets. He called it taking wealth from the air. He meant it literally. The air rights above the rail yards, sold to hotels and office developers, would pay for the underground work below. But standing in the concourse that February night, watching New York stare upward in something close to reverence, you wonder if he meant something else too. He took the chaos of a railroad terminal and turned it into a room worth looking at. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, almost everything. Jump forward. 1943. The constellations are still there, but the windows are blacked out. Wartime. The terminal runs 24 hours, jammed with soldiers and nurses and war bond posters and USO volunteers. Women are being trained for jobs they were never offered before. The building is under pressure, it was never designed to hold, and it holds it. 1974. The ceiling is dark with soot, decades of cigarette smoke and coal dust carried in on winter coats. A Kodak advertisement, enormous, covers part of the south wall. The skylights have not been cleaned since before the war. The terminal smells of the city's exhaustion. The railroad that built this place no longer exists in any functional sense. It merged, failed, and filed for the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history. And now there are serious men in serious offices holding architectural drawings of a 55-story tower they want to build directly through the waiting room. The concourse still fills every morning. People still catch trains. The clock above the information booth, 4 faces, each telling the same time, still pulls people toward it like a compass needle toward north. A building scheduled for demolition, still functioning as though nothing has been decided. 1998. The ceiling comes back. It takes 2.5 years and a very specific solvent to undo what time did to Helliu's constellations. When restorers first test the solvent on a small patch in a corner, the blue that emerges is so vivid it looks artificial. It is not artificial. It is simply what the ceiling always was, underneath everything that had settled on it. When the work is finished, people walk into the main concourse, look up, and stop moving, just for a second. Then they keep going. This morning again, 6:46 now. The man in the gray coat has his phone out and is not looking at the ceiling. The woman with the wheelie bag is Already halfway down the ramp toward the lower level, a school group from New Jersey is arranged in a loose, confused cluster near the information booth, their teacher saying something that no one is quite hearing. The four-face clock reads 6:47. In 1 minute, the 6:48 to Poughkeepsie will open its doors on track 34. The system runs on intervals measured in seconds, managed by computers that replace the men who once worked 760 levers in the signal towers 2 floors below the concourse, towers that most of the people walking overhead have no idea exist. That is the thing about Grand Central Terminal. The part you can see is extraordinary, but the part you cannot see is what keeps it alive. The buried loop tracks, the underground electrical substation 4 stories deep, the maintenance tunnels, the porters who for decades carried bags for tips instead of wages because the railroad had decided that was more efficient than paying them a salary. The ceiling is beautiful. The ceiling is real. But this story is about everything underneath it. Grand Central Terminal is not, despite what the architecture suggests, primarily a work of art. It is a machine for moving people, generating real estate value, consolidating corporate power, and managing the flow of an entire city that happens to be housed inside something magnificent. It opened in 1913. It nearly died in the 1970s. It was saved by a Supreme Court ruling that changed preservation law across the United States. It has been owned by a railroad dynasty, a bankrupt corporation, a private investment firm, and finally, as of 2020, by the public. And through all of it, every single morning, the shoes keep landing on the marble. The clock reads 6:48. The train to Poughkeepsie is boarding now, January 8, 1902. A winter morning on the New York Central Line. Train number 6 departs White Plains, picks up passengers at the usual stations, and enters the Park Avenue Tunnel just south of 96th Street shortly after 7 in the morning. The tunnel is long and narrow. It fills quickly with the smoke of a steam locomotive. Visibility drops. The engineer relies on the signal system, fixed lights that tell him whether the track ahead is clear. The signal shows green. It is wrong. Ahead in the darkness, train 1176 has stalled. 17 cars stopped on the tracks, invisible in the smoke. Train 6 hits it at full speed. 15 people die. Dozens more are injured, some pulled from the wreckage hours later. It is not the worst rail accident in American history, not even close, but it happens in New York City, which means it happens in front of everyone. The newspapers do not let it go. The Park Avenue Tunnel had been a problem for years before anyone died in it. Steam locomotives running underground filled the passage with carbon monoxide and sulfurous smoke thick enough to make engineers lean out of their cab windows just to see the signals. Visibility was a guess on good days and a gamble on bad ones. The railroad knew this. The railroad had always known this, but fixing it would cost money, and the system was working until the morning it wasn't. After January 8th, the New York State Legislature moves with unusual speed. Within months, it passes a law banning steam-powered locomotives from operating south of the Harlem River after July 1st, 1908. 6 years to comply. The New York Central Railroad, which runs Grand Central Depot at 42nd Street, now faces a problem with no obvious solution. You cannot run a railroad terminal without locomotives. You cannot run steam locomotives in Manhattan anymore. You need a new kind of power, and a new kind of terminal to run it through. The crash had made the decision for everyone. Now, someone had to figure out what came next. William J. Wilgus is the chief engineer of the New York Central when he sits down and writes what his colleagues will later describe as a letter that changed the shape of Midtown Manhattan. He is not, by personality, a man given to flourishes. His reports are meticulous. His calculations are documented to the decimal point. But in this letter, written to Railroad President William H. Newman in late 1902, something shifts, a technical proposal that is also, quietly, a vision. Wilgus proposes to bury the entire terminal, not renovate it, not patch it. Bury it. Sink the tracks below street level, cover them with a deck, and build a new terminal above, electrified, double-decked, with loop tracks at both levels so trains can arrive, unload, and circle back to storage without ever reversing. No more steam, no more smoke, no more collisions in the dark. And then, this is the part that sounds like it belongs in a different kind of story. He proposes to sell the air above the buried tracks. The covered yards will create developable land in one of the most valuable locations on Earth. Hotels, office towers, apartment buildings, all of it rising above the railroad's infrastructure, all of it generating rent that flows back to pay for the construction below. He is describing in 1902 what we would now call air rights development. He is inventing it. The letter is approved. What drives a decision this large is never only engineering. The Vanderbilt family has controlled the New York Central since Cornelius Vanderbilt consolidated the Harlem, Hudson River, and New York Central lines in the 1860s. By the time of the 1902 crash, professional managers run day-to-day operations, but the institutional psychology remains. The New York Central does not simply want to move people. It wants to be seen moving them. It wants the terminal to announce in stone and scale that this railroad is the gateway to New York City. There is also the matter of the Pennsylvania Railroad. The Pennsylvania, the New York Central's primary rival, has announced plans to tunnel under the Hudson River and build a new station on the west side of Manhattan. When it opens, as Penn Station in 1910, it will be Beaux-Arts, monumental, and unmistakably a statement of power. The New York Central cannot respond with something merely adequate. Whatever rises at 42nd Street must be at least as grand, preferably grander. Ambition in this case is not vanity, it is competitive strategy dressed in marble. The Vanderbilts wanted grandeur. The engineers wanted function. For a while it looked like they'd get neither. 4 firms are invited to compete: Daniel Burnham, McKim, Mead and White, Reed and Stem, and Samuel Huckle Jr. Reed and Stem win. Their proposal built around Wilgus's operational logic: ramps instead of stairs, elevated roadways that allow traffic to flow around the terminal, a circulation plan that treats the movement of people as seriously as the movement of trains. Then William K. Vanderbilt intervenes. He wants Whitney Warren's firm involved. Warren and Vanderbilt moved in the same social circles, and Warren's Beaux-Arts sensibility appealed to the family's appetite for grandeur. Warren and Wetmore are brought in as co-designers, the associated architects they call themselves, with Warren handling the exterior and Reed and Stem concentrating on the circulation systems beneath. The arrangement is tense from the beginning. Warren will later claim most of the credit for the building. Reed and Stem will sue. The courts will eventually side with them, but before any of that, the 2 firms have to build something. What they agree on, eventually, after arguments that stretch across years, is a building organized around a single idea Wilgus had put in the original letter: the movement of people is a system, and a system can be designed. The ramps that sweep through Grand Central are not decorative. They were tested with real people carrying real luggage before a single inch of marble was laid. The incline, 8 degrees, was selected because it allows a person to walk naturally, without slowing down, without thinking about the slope at all. The ticket windows are placed where your eye naturally falls as you descend. The exits align with where your feet are already taking you. The building does not direct you. It makes you think you chose. By the time excavation begins in earnest, the first cut along Lexington Avenue on June 19, 1903, the scale of what is being attempted is coming into focus. more than 3 million cubic yards of Manhattan bedrock will need to move. 25 miles of pipes and sewers will be rerouted. 200 buildings will come down, and through all of it, trains must keep running. The crash in the Park Avenue tunnel killed 15 people. The response to it will reshape 400 acres of Midtown Manhattan, create a new legal framework for urban air rights, and produce a building that over a century later still fills with shoes on marble every morning at 6:45. Disasters in New York have a way of becoming architecture. There's a photograph taken sometime around 1908 on the east side of Park Avenue, somewhere between 45th and 46th Street. In it, you can see the cross-section of Midtown Manhattan. On the left, a completed section of the new terminal's steel frame, columns and girders rising clean and precise, bolted together in the cold air. On the right, the old Grand Central Station still standing, its iron train shed intact, passengers moving through it as though nothing unusual is happening 40 feet away. And in the middle, the open cut, a trench the width of a city block, dropping 10 stories into the earth, with men and equipment moving along its floor like insects at the bottom of a canyon. The photograph looks like a mistake, like two different cities occupying the same block at the same time. That is exactly what it was. The problem Wilgus set for his engineers in 1903 was not simply building a new terminal. Any competent firm could build a terminal on an empty lot. The problem was building one on a lot that was not empty. That was, in fact, one of the busiest railroad junctions in the world, without stopping the trains, not slowing them, not rerouting them for a season, not stopping them at all. The solution was what construction managers called the bite method, a term so mundane it almost hides the audacity of what it describes. The site was divided into sections. One section at a time was excavated, demolished, and rebuilt, while the sections on either side remained operational. Trains ran through active sections while workers blasted and dug 30 feet below. The sequence moved along the site the way a hand moves along a railing, continuous contact, one grip releasing only after the next is secure. It worked. It also cost twice what a clean slate build would have cost, and took 3 years longer than the original schedule. Both of these facts were known in advance and accepted. There was no other option. The numbers, laid out plainly, are almost impossible to hold in the mind at once. 3.2 million cubic yards of earth and rock removed from a hole in the middle of Manhattan. 118,000 tons of steel erected inside that hole. More than 200 buildings demolished across a 17-acre site, residents displaced, businesses shuttered, entire blocks erased. And above all of it, for the entire duration, the trains. The old iron train shed was dismantled using a traveling scaffold, a movable framework that crept along the shed's length, unbolting sections and lowering them to the ground while the tracks beneath remained in service. The shed came down one bay at a time, like a sentence being erased word by word while the meaning stayed intact until the last word was gone. Below street level, the engineering becomes stranger and more specific. Wilgus's double-deck loop system, the operational heart of the terminal, required track layouts no station in the world had attempted at this scale. The upper level would handle long-distance trains. The lower level would handle suburban and commuter traffic. Both levels would use loop tracks at their far ends, allowing trains to arrive at a platform, discharge passengers, continue around the loop, and return to a storage track without ever reversing direction. This matters more than it sounds. A terminal without loops requires a locomotive to detach from one end of a train, run around to the other, reattach, and pull back out, slow, wasteful of track space, and limiting to the number of trains a station can move per hour. With loops, A train that arrives at 8:04 can be back in storage by 8:11 and cleared for another departure by 8:18. Multiply that across the terminal's 67 tracks and 44 platforms, and the numbers start to approach what Wilgus had promised, a terminal theoretically capable of handling 200 trains per hour. No station on Earth had ever processed that volume. Most still haven't. The structural engineers working beneath the terminal faced a problem specific to Grand Central's geometry. The loop tracks required large, uninterrupted spans at both levels to accommodate the movement of trains, which meant that the columns supporting the floors and the streets above could not be placed where structural logic would normally put them. The spans had to stretch further. The girders had to carry loads that pushed the limits of what steel fabrication in 1905 could reliably produce. One girder near Park Avenue carries nearly 2 million pounds, the equivalent of stacking 1,000 full-size sedans on a single steel beam. Get that calculation wrong once, and the concourse above does not exist. These are not figures that appear in the building's public history, in the guidebooks, or on the plaques near the information booth. They are buried in engineering reports that almost nobody reads. Above these calculations, people eat oysters and check the time. The workforce that made this possible numbered more than 10,000 at the project's peak. They worked in shifts around the clock, blasting through Manhattan schist with dynamite charges timed for night when the surrounding streets were quieter, not empty, never empty, but quieter. They relocated pipes in the dark and poured concrete in sections no wider than a hallway. The official accounts of the construction are proud of one particular statistic. No pedestrian were reported injured during the entire project. The qualification in that sentence, pedestrians, is not accidental. It carries the full weight of what it leaves out. The injuries and fatalities among the construction workers themselves are far less systematically recorded in the public record, noted briefly in company reports, and almost never in the newspapers that covered the project's progress with consistent enthusiasm. 10,000 men, dynamite, 10 years. The names of the workers do not appear on any plaque inside the terminal. There is one more piece of infrastructure that deserves attention before the building opens its doors. 4 stories below the Gray Bar building, accessible through a locked door in a corridor most employees never use, sits substation M42. It is a 4-story underground room housing the rotary converters that take 11,000-volt alternating current from the city grid and convert it to the direct current that runs in the third rail beneath every platform. Without M42, no train enters or leaves Grand Central. Without M42, the terminal is an extremely expensive marble room. During the Second World War, the United States government identified M42 as one of the most strategically critical facilities on the eastern seaboard. If enemy saboteurs could introduce abrasive material into the converters, destroying their bearings from the inside, the entire Northeast rail network would go dark. Armed guards were stationed at every entrance. The location was classified. The building that New York celebrated as a democratic civic monument was built on a buried electrical system defended like a weapons installation. Both things were true. At Grand Central, they usually are. In 1904, the stretch of Park Avenue running north from 42nd Street was not an address anyone coveted. It was a rail corridor. The tracks ran at grade or just below it, behind wooden fences and ventilation grates that exhaled the breath of steam locomotives onto the sidewalk. The buildings along it were modest, rooming houses, light industry, the kind of structures that exist not because anyone planned them, but because the land was cheap and the smell was tolerable if you kept the windows closed. The wealthy lived on Fifth Avenue, away from the noise. By 1930, Park Avenue was the most expensive real estate in Manhattan. That transformation did not happen because of market forces or civic planning or the natural logic of a growing city. It happened because Wilgus buried the tracks, decked over the yards, and handed a private railroad the legal authority to decide what would be built above them. When the New York Central sank its tracks below street level and covered them with concrete decking, it created a platform, in the most literal sense, above which new buildings could rise. The railroad owned the air rights to this platform. It could lease parcels to developers, set the terms of construction, choose which hotels and office towers would be built and which would not. The income from those leases would flow back to service the debt from construction below. A private corporation had used a public infrastructure project to reshape an entire district of Manhattan according to its own financial interests. The city barely noticed because it was too busy admiring the result. The hotels came first. The Biltmore opened in 1913, connected directly to the terminal by an underground passage. You could arrive from Chicago and be asleep in a hotel bed without ever touching the street. The Commodore followed in 1919, then the Roosevelt in 1924, each positioned to catch arriving passengers before they reached the street, to offer a room, a meal, a drink, a reason to stay inside the Vanderbilt ecosystem a little longer. Then the offices, the Graybar Building, the Channon Building, the Chrysler Building rising in 1930 at Lexington and 42nd, its stainless steel crown visible from the terminal's upper windows. The New York Central Building itself, now the Helmsley, sitting directly astride Park Avenue at 46th Street, traffic diverted around it by viaducts that Wilgus had insisted on from the beginning. Terminal City, they called it, a neighborhood built by a railroad, for a railroad, financed by the passengers moving through it every day without knowing they were the raw material of someone else's real estate strategy. By 1927, Grand Central handles 43 million passengers a year. On a typical weekday in the late 1930s, 100,000 passengers pass through the main concourse. Another 200,000 people enter the building who are not catching trains at all, eating, shopping, meeting, passing through on their way somewhere else. The terminal has become so central to the city's daily life that it is no longer possible to separate it from the city itself. The Grand Central Art Galleries occupy space above the concourse, showing work by painters and sculptors to an audience of commuters who would never otherwise set foot in a gallery. A newsreel theater runs continuously from morning to midnight. CBS establishes broadcast studios in the terminal, transmitting via an antenna on the Chrysler Building. The Oyster Bar, one floor below the main concourse in its vaulted Guastavino tiled room, serves lunch to railroad executives and, on occasion, to the kinds of writers who later describe it as the best room in New York. The building is performing a version of civic life that its engineers never designed it for. It simply became, through use and accumulation, the room where the city met itself. But the story of who this city within a city was built for requires a different kind of attention. In the 1920s, Grand Central employs approximately 500 red-cap porters. They carry bags, guide passengers, answer questions, manage the flow of crowds during peak hours. They are, in operational terms, the human infrastructure of the terminal, the layer between the building's physical systems and the passengers those systems are designed to serve. They are almost entirely black men. A 1930s investigation published under the title Slaves of Grand Central Terminal documents what their employment actually looked like. Salaries as low as $1 to $18 per month for most workers, with only a small core receiving anything approaching a living wage. The remainder depend entirely on tips, income that fluctuates with the season, the economy, the mood of whichever passenger hands over a bag. New workers are in some cases required to serve unpaid trial periods before receiving any compensation at all. Supervisors take a portion of earnings. The railroad takes the rest. James H. Williams is hired as a redcap in 1903, the same year construction begins. By 1909, he is chief of the redcap workforce, a position he holds until 1948. He supervises this system for nearly 4 decades, its hierarchy, its indignities, and in the gaps it left, its occasional generosities. Contemporary profiles note that he helps young men in his workforce pay college tuition from the margins of what the terminal allows them to earn. The profiles intend this as a compliment. Read carefully, it describes a man doing what he can inside a structure specifically designed to limit what is possible. The PhD carries your bags. That is the line journalists use. They mean it as an observation about wasted talent. It is also an observation about what the terminal considered talent worth paying for. Below the concourse, in spaces the public never enters, there are rooms that tell a different story about how the building actually functions. A sub-basement space nicknamed Carey's Hole, after J.P. Carey, whose barbershop stored goods there, evolves over decades into a lounge and dormitory for railroad employees working overnight shifts. Men sleep there between rotations, store their personal belongings in lockers along the walls. The building runs 24 hours because people live inside it, in rooms that don't appear on any tourist map. The platform inspectors control access to the tracks, ticketed passengers only beyond a certain point, a mechanism framed as security, but also a way of maintaining the social geography of the terminal, keeping the concourse legible as a public space, while the operational machine behind it remains closed and controlled. The ramps designed to move passengers efficiently also keep retail frontages in sightlines. The sightlines keep the concourse commercially productive. The commercial productivity funds the railroad's debt service. The debt service pays for the building. Every elegant design decision in Grand Central connects, if you follow it far enough, to a financial calculation made by people who were not among those doing the carrying. The electrified commuter lines running north from Grand Central reach Westchester by 1913, then the broader suburbs of Connecticut. The railroad promotes these routes aggressively, publishing guides to suburban living, partnering with developers building houses near its stations. It is scripting the geography of where the middle class will live. Routing prosperity north along the lines it operates, toward communities it can profit from. The commuters who pour through the main concourse every morning have organized their lives around it, where they sleep, where they work, how long their days are, because a railroad in 1913 made decisions that left them no other reasonable option. That is not a coincidence. That is the point. In 1946, Grand Central Terminal handles 65 million passengers. It is the peak, the absolute top of the curve, and almost nobody recognizes it as such at the time. The war is over, the soldiers are home, and the trains are full in the way they were full during the war, except now the mood is different. People are moving towards something instead of away from it. The terminal feels like the center of a country in motion. No one standing in that concourse in 1946 could have known they were watching the last of it. The highways come first. New York's expanding network of parkways and expressways makes it possible for a family with a car to move between the city and its suburbs without touching a train platform. The logic that made Grand Central necessary, that if you want to move between Manhattan and anywhere else, you pass through 42nd Street, begins to loosen one road at a time. Then, aviation. Idlewild Airport opens in 1948. By the mid-1950s, commercial air travel is no longer a luxury reserved for the wealthy. It is becoming a reasonable option for anyone crossing more than a few hundred miles. The long-distance trains that once filled Grand Central's upper-level platforms begin to empty. The 20th Century Limited, the overnight service to Chicago that was once the most famous train in America, with a red carpet rolled out on the platform at departure, loses passengers year by year until it becomes a memory dressed in its own mythology. The terminal's two levels had been designed for two different kinds of travel, the upper for the long-distance traveler with a trunk and a dining car reservation, the lower for the commuter with a briefcase and a habit. By the 1960s, the upper level is mostly the lower level. Grand Central is becoming quietly and without announcement a commuter station housed inside a monument. New York Central, carrying the debt from the original construction and paying property taxes on air rights it can no longer fully monetize, begins to look at the terminal differently. The building is no longer an asset generating income. It is a liability generating maintenance bills. The marble needs cleaning. The steel is rusting in places no tourist ever sees. The skylights painted over during wartime blackouts have never been restored. The celestial ceiling is the color of a basement ceiling. The building looks like what it is, something that was not maintained because the money ran out. In 1963, Pennsylvania Station is demolished. This matters to Grand Central not because they share a fate, but because they share a category. The people who tore down Penn Station did not think they were destroying something irreplaceable. They thought they were clearing a site. When the wrecking ball hit the first Doric column, New York City discovered, too late, that it had no mechanism to stop the demolition of its own history. The city creates its Landmarks Preservation Commission in direct response, establishing it formally in 1965. 2 years later, in 1967, Grand Central's exterior is designated a protected landmark. The designation saves the facade. It does not save the railroad. In 1968, the New York Central merges with the Pennsylvania Railroad to form Penn Central. It is a merger of two struggling companies who believe that together they will be less desperate than they are apart. They are wrong. Penn Central loses more than $180 million in 1969 alone. In 1970, it files for bankruptcy, the largest corporate bankruptcy in American history at the time. The terminal is now owned by a company that does not exist in any functional sense. It has creditors, lawyers, and court-appointed managers. What it also has, increasingly, is a plan. And the plan involves architecture. Marcel Breuer, a respected modernist architect, designs a 55-story office tower to be built above the main concourse. The proposal does not merely add to the building. It requires removing the waiting room's windows, inserting the tower's steel base into the body of the terminal, and fundamentally altering what the concourse is. The Landmarks Commission, reviewing the plans in 1975, describes the result as an aesthetic joke. Penn Central calls it survival. The legal battle that follows will reach the Supreme Court. That story belongs to the next chapter. What belongs here is what the building looks like on the inside during these years. The concourse fills every morning and empties every evening, the rhythm unchanged. But the building around that rhythm is deteriorating in ways that accumulate slowly and then all at once. Advertising panels cover the south wall. Drop ceilings have been installed in rooms off the main concourse to save on heating costs. The ramps are grimy. The oyster bar survives, but barely. And in the tunnels below, in the maintenance passages that run beneath the platforms, through the steam pipe corridors that keep the building warm in winter, something worse is happening. Metro North, which takes over commuter operations in the early 1980s, deploys in-house maintenance workers to remove aging pipe insulation in the tunnels. The insulation is asbestos. The workers are not always clearly told this and are not consistently given adequate protection. They labor in passages where temperatures reach 140 degrees, tearing out insulation with their hands, breathing the air around them without knowing what it will cost them later. They are called, in the lawsuits that follow, the snowmen of Grand Central. The name comes from the white dust that covered them when they emerged from the tunnels at the end of a shift. The building that New York fought to preserve was, at the same moment, doing quiet damage to the people keeping it alive. In the spring of 1975, Jacqueline Kennedy Onassis writes a letter to Abraham Beame, the mayor of New York City. She is not writing as a former First Lady, she is writing as a New Yorker, and the letter has the directness of someone who has decided that a particular kind of patience is no longer appropriate. Grand Central Terminal, she writes, is not simply a building. It is a piece of the city's identity, something that, once destroyed, cannot be reconstructed, cannot be apologized for, cannot be returned. Beame has limited room to act. The legal machinery is already moving. Penn Central's argument is straightforward, if brutal in its honesty. The railroad is bankrupt. The terminal sits on some of the most valuable air in Manhattan. Brewer's Tower, 55 stories of rentable office space, would represent the difference between a company that can service its debts and one that cannot. The Landmarks Commission has rejected the proposal. Penn Central's lawyers argue that this rejection is an unconstitutional taking. The city has effectively confiscated hundreds of millions of dollars in development rights without compensation, which the Fifth Amendment does not allow. It is not an unreasonable legal argument. Property rights are real, air rights are real. A government agency telling a private owner what it cannot build on its own land is, at minimum, a serious constraint. The question is whether it crosses the line into confiscation. Penn Central takes that question to the Supreme Court. Before the court rules, the fight plays out in the streets and the newspapers and memorably on a train. The Municipal Art Society organizes what becomes known as the Landmark Express, a chartered train from New York to Washington carrying preservationists, architects, city officials, and Jacqueline Onassis, traveling to attend oral arguments and to make visible, in the most literal way, what is at stake. It is a gesture that understands how public attention works. Put the most recognizable woman in America on a train to save a train station, and the story writes itself. Onassis is genuine in her commitment, but her presence also performs a particular kind of politics, framing the preservation of Grand Central as a matter of cultural sophistication versus Philistinism, of civilization versus developers. This framing is effective. It says nothing about the red-cap porters whose labor made the concourse run, or the maintenance workers whose health had been quietly spent in the tunnels below. The case for preservation is made entirely in the language of architecture and civic memory, real values, and not at all in the language of labor or equity, which are also real values. The beautiful building is saved. The people who kept it running are not part of the argument. On June 26, 1978, the Supreme Court rules 6-3 in favor of New York City. Justice William Brennan writes the majority opinion. The landmark law, he argues, does not constitute a taking because it does not eliminate all economic use of the property. Penn Central can still operate the terminal, still earn revenue from it, still transfer its unused development rights to other sites nearby. The regulation burdens the owner, but burden is not confiscation. The ruling establishes what becomes known as the Penn Central test, a multi-factor balancing framework that courts apply to regulatory takings claims to this day. It is one of the most cited land use decisions in American legal history. Every city that has designated a landmark since 1978 has done so in the shadow of this ruling. Grand Central is saved, and in being saved, it becomes a legal instrument. That instrument cuts in more than one direction. The same framework that protects Grand Central from demolition can be used, and has been used, to freeze neighborhoods that property owners want preserved exactly as they are. Historic district designations, modeled on the logic of the Penn Central ruling, have blocked affordable housing developments, resisted transit infrastructure in established neighborhoods, and given organized communities of homeowners a legal mechanism to resist density that zoning would otherwise allow. Preservation is Not inherently conservative, but the tools of preservation can be picked up by people whose interests have nothing to do with architecture and used with perfect legal legitimacy. Onassis and the Municipal Art Society wanted to save a great building. They did. The precedent they created in doing so belongs to everyone now, including people whose definition of what deserves to be preserved has everything to do with keeping their neighborhood exactly as it is. One more thread runs through this period and rarely appears in the celebratory accounts of Grand Central's salvation. In 2006, after years in which the rail operations were publicly managed while the building itself remained privately owned, a company called Midtown Trackage Ventures, operating under the Argent Ventures Group, purchases the terminal and its associated air rights. In 2015, when the city rezones the East Midtown district to allow taller buildings nearby, the ownership group sues, arguing that the rezoning has devalued its transferable development rights by $475 million. The argument is structurally identical to Penn Central's argument in 1975. A private owner holding air rights above a landmark claims that a government decision has taken value without compensation. 40 years after the Supreme Court ruled that Grand Central's landmark status was constitutional, the building's owners were making the same claim about their air rights that the railroad made when it wanted to put a tower through the waiting room. The legal tools change hands. The financial argument remains the same. The restorers work at night. It is the only practical time. The terminal quieter, the crowds gone, the concourse belonging briefly to the people who maintain it rather than the people who pass through it. They work from scaffolding erected after the last train, dismantled before the first. And what they are doing, in the late 1990s, is uncovering a color that no living person has seen. The celestial ceiling had been painted in 1912. Decades of settled grime had turned it from Mediterranean blue to something closer to charcoal. When restorers first test a solvent on a small patch in a far corner, the blue that comes back stops them cold. It is not unusual paint beneath the soot, it is simply what was always there, waiting. The restoration takes 2.5 years. When it is finished, people walk into the main concourse, look up, and stop moving, just for a second. Then they keep going. The 1990s work does more than clean a ceiling. The east staircase, drawn in the original plans, never built because funds ran short before opening, is finally constructed on the building's east wall, exactly where the architects intended it. Ramps sealed for decades are reopened. Vanderbilt Hall, cluttered with commuter facilities, is cleared and restored to something approaching its original volume. The terminal becomes, for the first time in 50 years, legible as the building it was meant to be. Retail follows: food halls, restaurants, eventually an Apple store in what was once a lower-level waiting room. The economics sustaining Grand Central are no longer railroad economics. They are the economics of a destination, a place people come to rather than through. The building has been reprogrammed, the way Wilgus always said it could be, except the revenue now comes from oysters and laptops rather than air rights and commuter fares. Beneath all of this, boring continues. The East Side Access Project, eventually opened as Grand Central Madison, spends 15 years and $11 billion excavating new caverns directly beneath the existing terminal. 8 new tracks for the Long Island Railroad, bringing trains from the east side of the city into a station that previously served only the north and northeast. The machine is still being expanded. A building that opened in 1913 now sits above more than a century of accumulated infrastructure, each layer built on the logic of the one before it, each generation of engineers inheriting the decisions of the last and adding their own. In 2020, the MTA purchases Grand Central Terminal outright. After more than a century, Vanderbilt's to Penn. Central to private investors, The building is publicly owned for the first time. The capital repair bills are large. The structural needs are significant. Public ownership does not automatically mean public generosity. What it means in practice is still being worked out. This morning, again, the shoes on the marble, the four-faced clock, the light coming through the arched windows at an angle that shifts with the season, lower in January, higher in June, always the same gold. A woman checks the departures board and turns left toward the ramp. A man in a maintenance uniform pushes a cart along the edge of the concourse, moving against the flow of commuters without interrupting it. A child points at the ceiling and says something to the adult beside her. The adult glances up briefly, then back at the phone. The 802 to Croton Harmon is boarding on track 29. The building that nearly came down in the 1970s, that was saved by a Supreme Court ruling, that was cleaned and restored and expanded and reprogrammed and sold and bought again. It is doing this morning exactly what it has done every morning since February 1913. It is moving people through, not gracefully, not dramatically, not with any awareness of its own history, just continuously. The way a river moves without deciding to. Grand Central Terminal was built to last. What its builders could not have predicted is how many different things it would need to survive in order to do that. How many times it would need to become something other than what it was designed to be, and how many people, most of them unnamed, would do the work of keeping it running while the city argued about what it meant. The clock reads 8:03. The doors close. The train pulls out. On the platform, the next group is already forming.